So the first topic that we're going to look at on this sort of Unit 8 refresher is differentiating between those different forms for quadratic functions. In our last unit, we talked about 3 different formats that we can have for quadratic functions. So we're going to look at those today. We're going to look at identifying what form I have. Then we're also going to refresh on what each of those forms shows me. So I know every different form shows me some key information, some important information from the graph of that function. So we're going to refresh on what information I know based on the graph. And then we're also going to identify that particular key feature for our given function. So if I take a look at number 1, my function is 2x squared plus 3x minus 9. I've got 3 terms here, an x squared, an x, and a constant term. This is standard form. Standard form tells me the y-intercept for my graph. The y-intercept is that constant term at the end of my function. So our y-intercept for this guy would be -9. Number 2, I've got x in parentheses with something and it's being squared. Then I'm adding something at the end. This is vertex form. Anytime I see x in parentheses with something squared, that's probably going to be vertex. Vertex form tells me the vertex. And my vertex comes from this number in parentheses with x, and then whatever I see at the very end of my function. This is really similar to point slope form. Like that's where I would get, those locations would be where I would get the same pieces of information. If I wanted to point on the graph from point slope form, I would get them from here and here. Same thing for vertex form. So my vertex here, the only tricky part is that whatever I have in parentheses with x, it's the opposite sign for that x coordinate for my vertex. So since this is x minus 1, it's +1, 4. Since this is a point on my graph, I want to put it in parentheses. That tells me this is an ordered pair. This is a point on my graph. Number 3, I've got 2 sort of parenthesis groupings here, x with some number inside each of them. This is what intercept, or we also called it factor form. This is intercept form. Intercept form gives me my x-intercept. My x-intercepts are those numbers in parentheses with x. And just like when we pulled out the x-coordinate of the vertex, it'll be the opposite sign. So x minus 2 means we have an x-intercept at +2. X plus 1 means we have an x-intercept at -1. I talked about this as we were talking about x-intercepts in Unit 8, but I also saw this error fairly frequently on our test. If you're giving me a list of x-intercepts and you separate those x-intercepts with a comma, that's okay. What's not okay is to put parentheses around that. This, as soon as I put parentheses around it, is no longer a list of x-intercepts. Now you've given me an ordered pair. You've given me a point on the graph. If you did this on your test, I marked it wrong because it's important that we understand the difference between describing an ordered pair and giving a list of features on a graph, okay? Comma in between is okay, but as soon as you put parentheses around it, you're now giving me a point on the graph, okay? And this point is not on the x-axis, so it's not an x-intercept. So this is not okay. Does that difference make sense? Okay. How about number 4? What form is number 4 in? So this is standard form. What do I get from standard form? The y-intercept. And what is the y-intercept for this thing? 1. How about number 5? This is vertex. Good. Hardest question of the day. What do I get from vertex form? The vertex. What is our vertex? Good. Remember, be careful with your signs on that x coordinate. This would be -6, -7. Since I'm describing a point here, put parentheses around this one. How about number 6? What form is that in? Vertex? So vertex form shows me the vertex. And then what is the vertex of this function? Yeah, so the tricky part here, if I look at this as vertex form, is that I don't see the y coordinate of my vertex like we did up here. That means that the y coordinate has to be 0. That's the only thing that we could be adding or subtracting there, where I could leave it off and it wouldn't change the problem. So our vertex would be -1, 0. Good. Now this one's a little tricky because I've left off that +0 at the end. There is another way that we could interpret this. So I could also look at this and say, well, since I have x + 1 squared, I could think about that as x + 1 and x + 1, sort of a non-condensed version. If I were to write it out like this, what does that look like? That looks like intercept form. So you also could have told me that this is intercept form and been correct. If I think about it as intercept form, then that means I would also get the x-intercepts of this thing. And my x-intercepts would be -1 and -1. Since it's the same x-intercept twice, I don't actually have to write it twice. But if you'll notice, our vertex has a y-coordinate of 0. That means that this is an x-intercept. My vertex is on the x-axis. Now, on your test, I didn't give you a problem like this originally. I'm not going to give you a tricky one like this and say what form is this when there could be multiple possible answers. But for some of the stuff we're going to see in Unit 9, it's important that we have that sort of flexible understanding of what this squared thing means, and that if I don't see that y coordinate, that means that it's 0. And then this idea is something that we're also going to see in Algebra 2. So I want to make sure that you see it here first, so that when it comes up in Algebra 2, you have a little bit of familiarity with that idea. Questions on number 6? Number 6 was kind of tricky. Okay, how about number 7? What form am I in here for number 7? Intercept or factored form? What does intercept form show me? The x-intercepts. And what are my x-intercepts for this thing? +5, -8. What about number 8? What form is number 8? Number 8's a little tricky, right? Because you gave me an answer, but you gave it sort of as a question. Fair? Okay. So let's start with number 8 by deciding what it definitely isn't. Number 8 is definitely not standard. So we had maybe it's vertex, intercept is the other one on our list. What do we expect to see for vertex form? I expect to see something in parentheses squared. Do I have that for number 8? No. So let's throw vertex off the list as well. We definitely know it's not standard. It doesn't follow that pattern for vertex. So it looks like this is intercept form. What's kind of throwing us off about identifying this as intercept form? Yeah, we usually expect for intercept form to see 2 sets of parentheses, like we did with number 7, but we don't see that here. So I want to point out something. We have 3 as our lead coefficient, and then just a plain old x. What could have gone in parentheses with x? What could have I added or subtracted that I wouldn't have to write? What's the only thing I could add or subtract that wouldn't change my problem? 0. So this x right here would actually be x minus 0. We didn't write the minus 0 because subtracting 0 doesn't change our problem. Just like adding 0 up here didn't change our problem. So this would be another way I could represent the same problem. Does that make sense? Okay. So what do we get from intercept form? What key features? X-intercepts. And what are the x-intercepts for this function? Yeah, 0 and 2. Good. Questions on number 8? Yeah. Doesn't matter. As long as you give me both of them, I don't care what order those x-intercepts are in. How about number 9? Standard. So if we think back to some of the factoring work that we did before break, a problem like this, we would have said, hey, that would be if the middle term is 0. What do we get from standard form? The y-intercept. And what is the y-intercept for this function? -4. Now, this is another one of those tricky problems where I could look at it as not just standard form. So if you told me this is standard form, you are 100% correct. This is a version of standard form. I can see the y-intercept is -4. But I could also consider this to be vertex form, using that same idea that we used here. So I could also say that this x squared came from x minus 0 squared. So this would also be a vertex form for this function. And it would have a vertex of 0, -4. Questions on number 9? Okay. Our last problem on page 1, number 10. What form are we in here? Standard. And what does standard form tell me? The y-intercept. And what is the y-intercept for this function? 11. Good. Okay. So this is all stuff, again, that we talked about as we were going through Unit 8. I believe when we started talking about different forms for these functions, we started with vertex form and then changed to standard form. Intercept was the last thing that we looked at. And we talked about all these key features that we get from these different forms as we went. But what I noticed on our test is that if I asked you for a specific form, you were able to give me a form of that function, but maybe not identify standard form or factored form. I saw a lot of things around. So I wanted to make sure that we got those different forms down pat. We know what they're supposed to look like. We know what features to give us, and we know where those features come from. Okay, this is big idea stuff. This is important. Tomorrow, we are going to take this idea and sort of evolve it. So I'm going to give you some different functions. So for number 11, here we've got standard form. I'm going to give you a function and ask you what form is this in? What's that key feature I get? What is the feature specific to this function? And then we're going to take it another step further, and I'm going to ask you to change it to factored form and vertex form. I'm going to give you several different functions, and we'll look at identifying what type of function I have, what's the form we have right now, and what do I know based on this form, just like we did today. And then the next step up will be switching it to those other forms so we can get the rest of those key features for that function. Okay, so that's what we're going to look at for tomorrow. For today, you have 2 Khan Academy assignments. One of them is asking you questions similar to this. If I want to know the y-intercept, what form do I need? Or if I want to know the vertex, what form do I need? And then maybe what is it based on the function? You have a second Khan Academy assignment that's going to ask you to practice multiplying and distributing things that look like this or things that look like this. And that's a skill we're going to need tomorrow as we practice converting between those different functions